Hey guys, it's Mrs. Severson, and welcome to your video lesson. Today we're going to be doing a kind of brief overview of how we created our Constitution. I know we talked about this last year in civics class, but I just want to take you through these things since it is our next unit in history and kind of how it fits into the historical context. So while I am taking you through this information, please make sure you're taking detailed notes and that you're following along and actively participating. Just sitting back is not enough for a video lesson like this. So just to take you through Articles of Confederation again, I hope you enjoy the SpongeBob meme to the right. Little comedy for your video lesson. Anyway, if you guys remember, it was adopted before the end of the Revolutionary War as kind of our initial plan for government. And hopefully you remember a couple of other things from civics class. If you don't, just why don't you pause the video for a second, collect your thoughts, and think through what was wrong with the Articles of Confederation we had talked about. They were not the greatest. So hopefully you will have remembered that this set up a very weak central government under the Articles, and Congress only really had a few powers, like they could declare war, and keep an army, but they couldn't actually raise their own army. They could sign treaties, but they couldn't regulate any trade or anything. They couldn't coin any money. Lots and lots of problems. Also, huger problems, if that's a word, is they didn't have a president under this government at all and no judicial system. So if you were committing a crime, there was really no one to keep you very accountable. So obviously, we didn't set up our government in a wonderful capacity to start with. So some of the problems that brought upon us, this is something we hadn't talked about last year, so make sure you take down some notes because these will be new information. We had problems with two big countries that we had dealt with, obviously, as colonies, and now we're dealing with as our own nation during the Revolutionary War and directly after. So biggest problems with Britain was that we couldn't actually follow our agreements with Britain to pay back our pre-war debts and restore land to the loyalists that had fought for Britain. So then Britain actually refused to pull their soldiers from our lands, which obviously did not make us happy. And Congress couldn't even raise an army at that point to get the soldiers out of there, and they also couldn't do anything more than go to each colony or state and say, hey, I really need this money to pay back Britain. Could you please help us out? And most of them would say, no, we have our own problems. See you later. Then our problems with Spain really started because Spain kind of saw us as their North American rival. After we started turning the tide of the war and eventually won the Revolutionary War, we took over a large section of what is now Louisiana and northern Florida, if you can see on the map down on the bottom. So Spain actually fought us over the border between Georgia and Florida and took the rights to the Mississippi River for a trading port. And since Congress couldn't actually get unanimous support for any sort of treaty, the issue went unresolved, and there was lots of fighting back and forth on that border for a very long time. So obviously you can see these are major problems already arising with the Articles. Another problem they had was economic crisis, which eventually led to Shays' Rebellion. Obviously, we had a huge recession economically after the war because Congress couldn't do anything about regulating trade. They couldn't do anything about raising any taxes or protecting anyone's property. So their solution was to actually create paper money in order to pay back the British. Well, the paper money wasn't backed by anything and was often different from state to state. If you can see the little examples there on the right of North Carolina and South Carolina currency, you can see there were different types of dollars. There were $5 bills, there were a third of a dollar bills, and each state actually had a different worth for their dollars. So it didn't really mean anything. It wasn't even worth the paper they printed it on. So inflation actually made that paper money really worthless. So people were freaking out about this problem, especially in like a very good example of this would be in Massachusetts, where Shays' Rebellion happened. Massachusetts had actually refused to make paper money because they didn't want to deal with the inflation problem. So they just simply raised their taxes for their local citizens. And a lot of farmers, which had borrowed heavily in order to feed the soldiers during the Revolutionary War, lost their farms. So they were really upset because they were the ones that helped keep food in the soldiers' bellies during the war. And now they were basically being punished for it because they couldn't pay taxes on all the land that they had borrowed. So there was actually a rebellion that happened in 1786 from these farmers. They actually decided to march and harass the state legislature and try to make sure that they couldn't foreclose on any of those farms. Uh, Obviously, this worked for a little while, and then the government got everything under control again. But the main point of this was that it showed yet another weakness under the Articles and the fact that we needed a new type of government. So they decided that clearly this wasn't working. So the founding fathers called a huge meeting. They said, we need delegates from every state. All delegates except for those folks from Rhode Island decided that they would go to this convention and revise the Articles. Eventually, James Madison was the one who decided in 1787, I'm calling this meeting. 55 people showed up. They had this in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. Originally, they wanted to just revise the Articles and strengthen the central government, but they ended up actually throwing it out completely because it was so bad. So if you've ever had like a paper or anything that you've just had to scrap because it was really bad and you couldn't make your point, you can kind of feel their pain. These guys were all really wealthy, educated, very respected men, so they knew that what they were going to do here was going to be very important to the future of the nation. Because remember, at this point, we're kind of just running around with chickens with our heads cut off, not really knowing what to do because nothing was working. So in true American fashion, they chose Washington again to be their leader. So he was the leader during the Revolution and now was the leader of the convention. And the biggest thing that they decided to do, if you remember from last year, we talked about they had wanted to keep their meetings secret because they didn't want the public to pressure them to go one way or another. And they thought that the best way they can come up with the best plan would be to keep themselves closed off from the public. So they came up with those two big plans. I'll just go over these briefly because we've gone over these before. The Virginia plan, right, was written by James Madison. So he was one of the Federalists. He decided to just completely throw out the Articles. His plan proposed two House legislatures. So that means like two houses of Congress, kind of like what we have now with the Senate and the House of Representatives. However, he wanted the number of representatives and legislators to be determined completely by population. And he agreed that three branches of government were needed. We needed a court system in addition to Congress, and we also needed a president. On the other side of the coin is the New Jersey plan written by William Paterson. So this one, small states would have preferred because Paterson wanted to keep and revise the Articles of Confederation, add the other two branches, and keep Congress as a one-house legislature. So just like if we had just the Senate or just the House of Representatives, and each state would only get one vote no matter how big or small they were. That caused some problems, obviously, because they're completely different. So the convention delegates had a huge job in front of them, which was to come up with some compromises to deal with some big issues. So the first thing they had to deal with, obviously, was merging both of those big plans. Roger Sherman, called the Great Compromiser, he's from Connecticut. He decided, you know what if we did it this way? He said that Congress should be two houses, just like we have it. And then the one house would be like the New Jersey plan and only have two votes per state, no matter what their size was. And then the other house would incorporate the Virginia plan, like the House of Representatives, and would be based on population. So it would make both sides happy. He said that voters should elect House members, and then House members would elect the Senate so that they could guard against, people inappropriately choosing their representatives. The other big problem that they had at the convention was the issue of slavery. This had come up when they wrote the Declaration, and they hadn't decided to do anything about it then, but they knew it was a problem now. So Franklin actually decided that originally in the Great Compromise that each state would get one representative in the House of Reps for every 40,000 people they had. However, then, it became an issue of how do you count people? This caused a huge rift or a huge fight between the northern and southern states, because in the north they didn't really have a lot of slavery, whereas in the south it was their complete way of life. So southern states wanted to count slaves in the population, and northern slaves thought they shouldn't. So take a second and pause and just think about why each of those people would want that to happen. Considering southern states actually owned slaves but wanted them to count in the population. So the compromise that they ended up coming up with was that for every 5 slaves, 3 people would be added for the population and tax purposes. So it kind of made both sides happy, I guess, with like the slave states winning out just slightly over. A little bit about the Constitution. We talked about this many times before in civics, but the Constitution was basically our new framework or our new plan for limited government. So it had those 3 branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial. It had the system of checks and balances that we had talked about, so that no one power could be, or one branch could be too powerful. It operated on that system of federalism and rule by the people, or popular sovereignty. And what was nice about it was it actually had representative government, so that not every single person had to decide on every single decision, because that just wouldn't work for our large scale of a country. Finally, to close this up, we did have a huge debate over the Constitution. It was enough of a debate to get it written in the first place, but then we had to figure out what to do with it and how to actually adopt it as our plan. So 2 huge groups emerged when they were debating over this. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. We had talked about these guys before, but just as a recap, the Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Adams. Those are the guys that wrote the Federalist Papers to try and convince the American public that this is the right thing to do. They were mostly supported by merchants and shop owners and large landowners, because they had been the ones that dealt most with the economic issues under the Articles. They wanted strong central government that was outlined in the Constitution. They wanted everyone to ratify the Constitution as quickly as possible. However, on the other side were the Anti-Federalists, led by people like John Hancock and Patrick Henry and even Thomas Jefferson, who helped write the Constitution. But they were mostly supported by small farmers and Westerners who were kind of suspicious of big government kind of taking over their way of life. And they were really freaked out by the fact that the central government seemed like it was too strong, and they didn't include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution itself, even though that was a central idea of the Declaration. Excuse me. So finally, eventually, after about 3 years of debate, the Federalists were finally starting to win out. They had promised to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution using the amendment system that we still use today. So Federalists said, okay, that's fine as long as it's done on, a quick timeline. And they finally ratified by all states. Rhode Island was the last holdout, by 1790, which was a full 3 years after the Constitution. So you can see this is a huge debate that took years to actually put into place. So just kind of think about that when you're thinking through, why does it matter that these guys, met in this delegation, in this convention? It's just a bunch of rich old white dudes. What do I care? This was what ended up setting up our country that we still have, 200 years later. So just make sure that you're thinking through all of these things as you're finishing up your video lesson. Hopefully you took good notes, and hopefully I got at least a couple laughs out of you. All right, have a good one.